In this video, I'm going to walk you through the process that I used to create this tanzanite ring. The materials that I've selected for this project are a 6x8mm oval stone, two 6-inch segments of 21 gauge square, a 6-inch segment of 18 gauge half round, another 6 inches of 14 gauge half round, and 2 feet of 22 gauge half round. The first step is going to be to take the two ends of my 22 gauge half round, pinch them together, and slide down so I can find the center of the half round, and fold it with the flat side facing in. I'm going to take my two squares and my 14 gauge half round and bundle them together with that 22 gauge half round, with my two squares sitting parallel to each other, the flat sides together underneath the flat side of the 14 gauge. I'm going to start by taking that loop that we used at the center of our 22 gauge, bring it across in the approximate center of what will be the bottom of our ring shank. I'm going to wrap it around a few times just to make sure everything is sitting flush and squared inside the coil. I'm going to flatten it with my pliers. From here, I can slide this section up or down to make sure that I'm in the dead center of the shank. Once I have it centered, I can go ahead and wrap a significant portion of our half round around both sides. I like to keep count as I go, how many full rotations on each side of our center weave at the bottom. This helps me ensure that I have the same amount of half round on both sides of the ring shank. I went ahead and wrapped my half round around both sides. It ended up being about 30 rotations from our center point to the end on both sides. What I'm looking for in terms of sizing is that when I'm sitting this weave on the mandrel, I should be just over the halfway point on both sides. From here, I can take the 14 gauge on both ends, bend it out away from the squares, and wrap the remaining balance of my 22 gauge half round around the squares. Once I have both sides finished, I can take my pliers, gripping just below where our coil ends, bend it back on itself. I'm going to do the same on both sides. Before preparing to bring our endings together to close the shank. To bring the endings over, I'm going to fold both of our squares towards the center until the exposed square sits at about a diagonal line, and they should sit parallel next to each other. so there's no rotation in the square. To connect the two ends of our shank together, we're going to use our 6 inches of 18 gauge half round. We're going to fold it in half, slide down to find the center point, so we once again have the same amount of working distance on both sides of the half round. Connecting the shank back together is quite easily the trickiest step in this ring process. I want to make sure that our squares sit as close together as possible and that they're sitting flat, like at the same angle. If they're rotated or they don't sit evenly next to each other, it can cause problems in sizing later on. I want to wrap around both squares enough times that my stone can comfortably sit on top of that wrapped section where the 4 wires cross through. 18 gauge is approximately 1 millimeter thick, so I passed around 8 times around both of my squares. Once I've coiled them, I can pull them to slide them flush as close as possible together. To keep them in the correct position, I'm going to go ahead and bend them both out 90 degrees from the coil, like so. That keeps the tension that I currently have in place, so it'll stay to size. Before connecting the shank together, here's where everything's at. My 2 18 gauge wires will actually be what secures the stone into place. My 2 squares will wrap through the shank and onto each coiled section. I'll finish by bringing my 14 gauge up over the top to complete the shape of the ring and protect the wire endings. I'm going to start connecting the shank together by passing my outermost square through underneath that coiled section on both sides. I do want to make sure that it's oriented so that it does not twist, and that my flat side that's facing down here remains flat down here. That'll prevent any unwanted or uncomfortable sections in the ring. To secure the wire to the shank, I'm going to pass it in a loop around the coiled section of squares, being sure to pinch it into place to secure it, before bringing it back up towards the top to trim it short. I want the wire ending to actually be on the underside, towards the inside of the ring in this case. So I'm going to trim it short and flatten it into place. I'll repeat the same process on the other side. Taking my square, going to bend it through. Making sure that I flatten it to shape. And then on the underside, I want to cut it short and flatten it to place to make sure that there's not a spur that would catch on the wearer. Alright, now that I have the two sides connected and the shank is secured, I can go ahead and add my other square on both sides, passing underneath and over the top. Cutting it short and pinching it to place on top of the ring shank. Repeating the same process on the other side, just being careful to make sure that the square doesn't rotate. Go ahead and cut it short, pinch it. Good to go. Connecting the shank back together and closing the ring while maintaining the size you're looking for is definitely the most challenging part of this ring design. It can take several tries and a little bit of practice to get right. Now that we have our ring shank closed, we can set our stone onto our two coiled square sections and bring our half round down over the stone with the flat side touching the stone and the round side facing up, and just spiral through the natural progression of the wire, securing the stone into place. We're going to pass both wire endings into that natural gap between the stone and our square connectors here. Starting with this one, I'm going to use my thumb to make sure that the stone is still secured into place and it hasn't slid out of its alignment. I'm going to carefully pull that half round down into that gap and then do the same on the other side. Still using my thumb to make sure that the stone stays where I want it to sit. From here we can adjust our half rounds one at a time, just making sure that we have equal tension on both wires and that the stone is sitting in the middle of the design where we want it to. And once we have it where we want it, we can cut that half round short and pinch that ending down on top of those squares. And do the same for the other side here. Last but not least, it's time to connect our 14 gauge back into the design. I'm going to follow along the line that we established with our coiled squares, and I'm actually going to bring that half round down in between that same section of squares, wrapping it around and finishing it on the two uncoiled squares here, just like we did with the half round securing the stone in place. Once I have that half round positioned where I need it, I can trim the ending short and flatten it on top of our two squares. Let's go ahead and pass our last half round here along the same line. Our last step is going to be to go ahead and slide it onto my mandrel to the size that we're looking for, just to make sure that it has a round shape. It'll sit comfortably on the finger. And here we have our finished ring. Sleek, low profile, and uses minimal amount of material to create the ring. As always, a huge thank you goes out to those who are already supporting the channel through Patreon. If you're interested in helping support what I'm doing here, check out the link to my Patreon in the description of this video.